Hi, my name is Natalie Lente, and I'm the Chief External Affairs Officer at Child Care Resources. My life work has been built upon a deep passion to level the playing field for children and for families who've been the most marginalized and oppressed, and to contribute to community efforts and initiatives that are rooted in the communities being served. I'm a fierce advocate for social justice and undoing systemic racism, and have been an active leader in all of our mission work at Child Care Resources. I believe that exclusion and inaccessibility to services happens when a system sets up a blanket approach to meet the needs of everyone and doesn't consider that different groups are aligned differently and have unique needs in relation to the systems and resources in our communities. Both of my daughters were adopted from the foster care system here in Washington State. I've seen very firsthand the impacts of trauma on kids in the most critical stages of their development and how effective interventions can change that. I'm going to share with you our suggestions for creating powerful communities and a responsive early learning system. I hope that you've had a chance to review the introductory video. It contains a lot of helpful background. Throughout our work, we discussed ensuring positive outcomes for all children and communities and families, but we were particularly focused on addressing the inequities in our early learning system for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Those of us who developed these ideas were a cross-section of parents, caregivers, early learning professionals, agency staff, and others who work with families and young children. There were also public outreach efforts to more than 2,000 individuals. Before providing an overview of the goals and strategies we've developed, I'd like to describe why these recommendations are so important. This is the information that we learned from the Community Needs Assessment. First, ensuring successful outcomes for young children and families requires strong community engagement. We also need to create strong, trusting partnerships that will help us to do a better job coordinating services between the state, regional, and local initiatives that support young children. A lot of good work has been done in the past 10 years in the state, and we can build upon that foundation. Yet we still need better coordination across the various services that support children and families. Our early learning system must respond to disparities in outcomes for communities of color, tribal communities, and other marginalized communities. This means acknowledging and interrupting racism and cultural bias, and integrating cultural beliefs and norms into learning policies and practices. We also need better data about children and families and the early learning workforce. We have some big gaps in data, including the need for better data about children of color and tribal children, as well as data on children and families using informal childcare options. Our data system is very fragmented, without the ability to integrate data from one program to the next. We need these improvements in data to fully understand where the state's early learning system is succeeding and where it's falling short. We also need state agencies to share data with local communities to better inform community-level planning and program decisions. Flexible and stable funding is needed to provide families with options for child care and supportive resources and tools for families engaged in informal care options. Currently, funding for early learning in Washington State comes from many sources with different rules and regulations. This results in confusion and disjointed support for children and families who may be receiving and often are receiving more than one service. It can also be a challenge for the early learning workforce who have had to manage different requirements for the same family, who are using programs funded by different pots of money. Parent and family involvement in planning and decision-making is key to having policies and programs that are responsive to families' strengths and needs. We recognize that families are lifelong educators and that a child's success in early learning is deeply rooted in strong partnerships with the families that love them the most. Now let's look at what we're proposing. Our group first developed broad goal statements to address ways to empower communities and create a responsive early learning system. The goals we proposed are what we hope to be true for the early learning system as a whole, what we want to achieve together in the future. Then we develop strategies that are actions through which we can accomplish these goals. Some strategies will address one goal, while others might address more than one goal. You won't hear a lot of details about how these strategies will be carried out. That will come later. Let's talk about the goals we proposed. Our first goal is that our systems be responsive to communities of color. The early learning system must be responsive to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and those historically marginalized. Communities of color need to be involved in designing and implementing early learning programs and services. The next is funding for equitable outcomes. We need to create enough funding for early learning to support equitable outcomes for children and families. Continuous improvement. All early learning services and supports must be designed to make sure they are continually improving and flexible enough to make any needed changes to benefit Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and historically marginalized communities. Parents, caregivers, and families need to be involved in this work. Community voice and partnerships. We need to make sure local communities have a strong voice in influencing early learning practices, policies, and decisions statewide. System infrastructure. We need to strengthen the supports for the early learning system, such things as improving data collection so we know how children and families are doing, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or improving coordination among programs and between state and local services. We also need to be mindful of how the data is collected and shared. Before finalizing data collection approaches, input from communities who will be affected by the data need to be requested. Let's talk about strategies we propose to accomplish the goals. Our first strategy is implement a coordinated, comprehensive data collection system involving state and community partners. Develop new definitions for what we mean by school readiness and life readiness. This will help us shape what should be included in our early learning system. Develop ways to measure progress towards our goals and to hold ourselves accountable for carrying out this early learning plan. Involve families and leaders of color to design and create approaches to racial disparities in early learning. It is our intention that the people of color and historically marginalized and oppressed families we serve have knowledge to make informed choices about their children and their families' early learning experience and have continuous access to those chosen experiences. Increase the amount or money for early learning services and supports and make sure those funds are used equitably, meeting the needs of marginalized communities. Fund and support parent voices at all levels of decision-making for the early learning system. Parents and caregivers are experts in their home cultures. They have a strong sense of community and know what their children need to survive. Their priorities center around their children and providing them with safe homes, food, and educational opportunities. Families want their children to grow up attached to and are proud of their cultural heritage and in early learning settings based on these home cultures. Expand opportunities to engage parent leaders that includes use of mentors and financial stipends for Black, Indigenous, parents of color, and historically marginalized communities to participate. Support every region in the state to ensure that they have a voice in making the early learning system responsive to families and providers in local communities, especially those most underserved communities. Explore and refine the ways in which the state defines and puts into practice early learning quality. Evaluate how quality is measured and how it's experienced by children, families, and providers. Assess the impacts of quality definitions on Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and underserved communities. Engage parents in the early learning workforce with state regulations are developed and updated. The work should be guided by equity and an anti-racism framework. Then finally, eliminate the digital divide for children and for families, making access to technology for Black, Indigenous, and people of color and other underserved communities more equitable. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me today. It was my honor to be a part of this work.